Welcome to week 4 of the course. My name is Richard Nakane Emerson, and today in this lecture I hope to talk to you about ethical decision making. While the topic of ethics seems quite dry and boring, it's something we don't cover in our high schools or in our universities in Australia unless you're studying philosophy. It is actually something that governs everything that you do, every decision you make in your daily life regarding other people and even yourself. In particular, it becomes very important when you are considering decisions you make in a professional context. First, we will look at what ethics are. Then we'll consider the connection between ethics and decision making, the ethical codes for your profession, the ethical codes for your studies, ethical scholarship, ethical theory, and understanding your personal ethics. This is actually very important. We dig into ethical theory, and you might find it a little hard to follow at first, but it really is worth looking at because it changes how you look at all the decisions you make in your life. The sixth thing we will address is ethical codes in your profession versus your personal ethics. Can you see how this is important? After that, we will look at what happens when people break their professional ethical codes. Why do they do that? And finally, how you can manage your ethical decision making in your profession and in your study so that you're not breaking the rules, but you're remaining true to yourself. So, what are ethics? The word ethic comes from the ancient Greek word ethikos, which is about moral character or nature. So metaethics is the philosophical aspects, all of the theory, all the stuff that people have been discussing since Socrates through to John Stuart Mill, etc., etc. Then you have normative ethics, where we apply philosophical ethics and decide the right courses of action. So this is connecting philosophy with action. And you might be thinking, I don't use philosophy. Well, you do, because that philosophy is inculcated, brainwashed into you through school, your religion, the parenting from your family or whoever raised you, the people around you, all the values that you get from society or you develop within yourself or you get from literature, spirituality or religion determine how you behave, your ethical decisions. So this is very relevant for you. And finally, applied ethics, the rules or obligations that determine the right course of action. And this is when we actually get down to the nitty-gritty of making ethical codes for various industries or industry associations or professional associations, etc., etc. Ethics is important to you because it is strongly connected with how you make decisions. And these decisions you will need to make in professional contexts. And people's lives often depend on it if you're in, say, health sciences or engineering or even IT, where increasingly computer systems have a very important role in running our whole society. So, your decisions on a course of action are informed by ethics. There is really no other reason for you to take an action. So the first would be your personal ethical position, normative ethics. And then the next are the rules, the codes applying to you in your position in society. So you have the law at various levels, and then you have obligations and socially expected behaviour. Then you have the code of conduct or code of ethics for your profession. And you've got to follow those rules, otherwise there are serious consequences. At this point, you might say, I don't follow rules, I don't have any ethics, I just do whatever I want. Well, actually, that is a form of ethics in itself. You could call that hedonism. We'll talk about that later, or ethical egoism, just suiting yourself. So everything you do is an ethical decision. So it is very much worth examining. Otherwise, you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, and you could end up in hot water. So when we consider your personal ethics or the rules applying to you in your professional position, which one should take precedence? I'd like you to remember that question and bring in your answer to class. Should you be following your personal ethics, or should you be following the rules of your professional association, for example, Engineering Australia or Physiotherapy Australia? Or should you be following the rules of your organisation, or should you be following your own personal ethics? Discuss that in the tutorial, week 4. Your profession will have ethical codes. They're typically called Code of Ethics, but they might be called Code of Conduct. In general, the Code of Conduct is more specifically about certain behaviours in certain situations, but they overlap so much. Some organisations just call what they have a Code of Ethics or a Code of Conduct, and some codes of ethics are short, but some are long, so it doesn't really matter. I'd just like you to look for the Code of Ethics or the Code of Conduct for your professional organisation and for any institution you work for in future, because you've got to make sure that you're working within those boundaries. Okay, so these are the rules you must follow as a professional in order to keep your professional membership in any professional body, or to keep your job in any institution you're working, a company or a government organisation or a university, or whatever that is. You also need to follow the ethical or code of conduct to avoid severe legal consequences. On this slide and the following slides, you'll see examples that are the actual correct links for the codes of conduct or codes of ethics for various professional bodies in Australia into which you will, become a member in order to conduct practice. So whether you're going to be a paramedic, an engineer, or an IT technician, whether you're going to be a pharmacist or pharmacologist, physiotherapist, or you're planning perhaps to go on to medicine, you will need to familiarise yourself with the code of ethics or code of conduct, so you know that you're actually doing the right thing as a member of that organisation. Now, if I haven't covered your field here or in the following slides, you can just Google Code of Ethics or Code of Conduct Australia and then your professional area, whatever that is, and then you'll find the professional body that's relevant to you, and after that you can look up Code of Conduct within their website or Code of Ethics within their website, or if you're lucky you'll just get that link just from the Google search. Currently, you have not graduated and you are probably not a member of your future professional organisation. However, you are a member of an educational institution, and that means that you have rights as well as obligations. And your obligations are to follow the ethical codes of the institution at which you study. Currently, Griffith College. For some of you, you may plan to go on to Griffith University or other universities. So, following the rules as required of you in your institution of study is called ethical scholarship or academic integrity. It applies to students and lecturer tutors alike, because we're all scholars, although there are probably separate codes for staff and students just because of the nature of different responsibilities we have for each other. The main focus of the ethical codes in educational institutions is integrity, honesty in all actions. So you need to be honest. Basically, if you're being honest in what you do, you're going to be following the rules you should be following. As a result, plagiarism, where you take work from somewhere and put it in your writing and don't correctly reference the source, or having a paper partially or wholly written by someone else, cheating in exams with crib notes on your arm, or copying someone else's work in an exam, padding a reference list where you add extra sources into your work just to make it look like you've done a lot of research that you haven't really done, fudging laboratory results when an experiment doesn't go as planned. A person might make up the results so that they go along with the predicted result. What should you really do in that situation? You should probably just report the real results and then discuss why those real unexpected results came about. That would be much better science, and you'd probably get a better grade. Moreover, if you get found out for fudging a lab result, this really puts a black mark against your name, and you are actually not doing the right thing in terms of academic integrity. So, collaborating with others when you are actually required to hand in individual work, and lying about your personal circumstance or circumstances to gain advantage, for example, to get an extension. The other important thing is, if you assist any other individual in such actions, this is also a breach of the rules in most educational institutions. And this applies to you and to me, to all of us. So basically, how do you follow the rules? Look them up, have a look at them, but the main thing is, are you being honest? Yeah. Are you showing integrity in what you do? If you are, then you're going to be fine with these rules. All academic institutions have a code of conduct or code of ethics for staff and students as scholars. Why do we, and why should you care? Well, you should care because this is really good practice for you to develop the ability to work within an ethical framework, a codified ethical framework, code of conduct, code of ethics, that you will need to do as a professional in your future job in industry. So learning about how these ethical codes of conduct work and learning how to work with them but still be a free thinker is an important skill. The next reason why you should care is by doing the right thing, you create a personal brand of integrity in the university that follows you into industry. We talk with each other, and many people who work in university also work in the professions as well. So, do you want to create a personal brand of integrity or shady integrity? So that's why you need to care about this. Another reason you should care is the penalties for an academic integrity breach, for breaching the code of conduct or ethics for a student, are severe, as they are, in fact more so, for people in teaching positions. You can get thrown out of university, and then you can be blacklisted so you cannot enter any other universities. That's a problem. And the other reason is that most of the time, the ethical guidelines for your institution are already in line with your personal ethics. And so it's nice to be aware that you're doing the right thing in terms of the organisation, but also to be aware of how that aligns with you personally. Just having awareness of what you're doing, your integrity as a person, acting with integrity, is a virtuous thing to do, and in many philosophical ways makes you a happier and more content person to know you're doing the right thing. Now, why do we care? Okay, well, the first thing is your ethical development is our responsibility as an institution. When we open our doors as an educational institution, that's part of the deal we sign up for, and we're being overseen by various organisations, including the Australian government. Also, from a selfish point of view, the organisation must protect its reputation and the standards of our awards for previous graduates. If we start letting people through with plagiarised work, anyone who's previously graduated, they suffer, and any future graduates also suffer. More importantly, we care because it's in line with our personal ethics, just like it is for you. educators and administrators, we have ethics, and if we work in an organisation which isn't doing ethical things or allows individuals to do things which are unethical, we are lessened. We feel, well, we wonder what the point is of our work. It's not easy going to a workplace thinking, today, what kind of unethical thing will I participate in? It's not the kind of thing anyone wants to do. So you can check all of the information about your obligations in the student charter, which is in the link at the bottom of this page. Here are the URLs that are the links respectively for Griffith College, for Griffith University students, and for staff, obviously, we do have our own ethical, academic integrity, ethical scholarship code of ethics to follow, which is the third link. Now we've discussed the rules that apply to you in your professional organisation and also the ethical rules that apply to you as a student, we need to think about how that works with our own ethics. And have you ever thought about what your ethics actually are? Perhaps until now you haven't had the opportunity to do so. It's not something that we really deal with in the Australian secondary school system. And in university, unlike some countries, we don't deal with it unless you're going into the field of philosophy. So here I'm going to give you a short breakdown of ethical theories, and we're going to look at a dilemma that helps you unpack how your brain works in terms of ethics and what that might make you as an ethical decision maker. What kind of ethical theories are actually informing your decision making? Okay, so here I've drawn a very simple diagram here that shows the main things at play when we talk about ethical life or conduct. So one of the first you'll notice on the right in a yellow circle is virtue. And this is about who you are as a person, who you feel you are as a person. And when you do something, or the way you are, is important to you because you see yourself as either a good person or not a good person. This affects all of us to varying levels, and it's strongly influenced by our philosophies and our religious background and so forth. Then in green, the green circle, you have the consequences of our actions. So what we do, our conduct, is measured as ethical or unethical on the basis of what the result is. If it benefits many, that's utilitarianism. So we see benefiting others and many is seen as a virtuous thing to do. So you have consequences and virtue intersecting there. If you're only in it to benefit yourself, that would be ethical egoism. And so that is the idea of the consequences for me are what are important. Now if we look down the bottom, we have in the purple circle rules and obligations. And rules and obligations are what society or organisations have created for us. And they guide us in terms of virtuous behaviour. And they also guide us in terms of what consequences we see as acceptable or unacceptable. For example, if I had to choose between the life of a child and a very old person. At this point, many people would expect, well, you've got to save the child first. This is an obligation or a rule that we have subjectively in our society because we believe that the young have the right to go on and live their lives, whereas the old one does not. Not all people hold that belief, but in any case, that is a rule. There are many rules. For example, save the women and children first when you put them in the lifeboats of the Titanic and all the men drown. That kind of thing. Or women not being allowed to participate on the front in military situations, military theatres up until very recently. So there are certain rules or obligations or beliefs that we have in society. Some of them are very specific laws or professional organisational rules by which we can actually be punished. Now deontology amongst these is much to do with Immanuel Kant, and this is the idea that what you do cannot be seen as virtuous if you happen to get a consequence that is good for yourself or others. It's the intention. So the intention makes the action good or bad. So if you intended to do the right thing but got a bad result, well, okay, that was still an ethical thing to do. Likewise, if you intended to be selfish but accidentally got a result that suited everyone else in a deontological point of view, according to Immanuel Kant, you can't just say, hey, I'm an ethical person, I'm a virtuous person, when actually you were in it just for, your own gain, or you were perhaps just acting arbitrarily and accidentally got a good result. So these are kind of how these ethical theories can be seen to fit together. Let's look at them in a little bit more detail, because unpacking these is very useful for you to develop a view of, or a concept of, how your ethics are working inside your mind. And remember, your ethics affect every decision you make that affects other people and even yourself. So let's look at ethics in a little more detailed way. Where do these ideas come from? And maybe get a little bit more of a handle on concrete interpretation of what they are, so that you might understand what your ethics, or where your ethics are coming from. Let's look on the right at virtue again. So virtue is about, who am I as a person? When I choose to do something or be in a certain way, I'm thinking about who that makes me, rather than the results of my actions. Now, virtue ethics you'll see in Confucianism. Confucius is probably one of the earliest proponents of virtue. Confucius urged people to follow good exemplars, so great scholars, people who live well, people in our society who we can hold up as someone who is ethical. And Confucius also said, live moderately. Does that sound like something that you feel as well? Maybe, maybe not. It still has a very strong effect in certain societies today. Don't underestimate how strong Confucianism is in the 21st century. Now, in the Western tradition, one of the earliest philosophers who discussed ethics was Socrates. And Socrates told us that knowledge of the world, being studious and philosophizing, gives you knowledge of self. And only through knowledge of self can you know what is virtuous to you, which is kind of what I'm doing right here and now, trying to give you some more knowledge of self in relation to ethics. And this virtue leads to joy. And there's no other way to be happy in life, according to Socrates. You've got to understand the ethics and understand the reasons for what you do. Decide on virtuous ways of living and virtuous conduct, and that will make you happy. That will make you content. Aristotle extended on this. Do good things, be content. Pretty simple. Epictetus, much later on, was actually a slave who was given the opportunity to study. Epictetus is exemplary of the Stoic way of thinking. And the Stoic way of thinking is quite self-disciplinary. So the idea is you've got to have health in mind and spirit. You shouldn't overindulge in anything. And this will lead to what he called apatheia, which is not apathy as we name it. It's a state of being contented. It's interesting, though, that we see that as apathy in modern sort of language. Of course, virtue then extends down into our religions from these traditions. Judaism, Christianity, we had the Ten Commandments, and, in Christianity we're urged to live or do as Christ would. In Islam, we're encouraged by the exemplar of Muhammad and to do things as Muhammad would do. You also see this echoed in Hindu religion as well as in Buddhism, where we're encouraged to find Buddha nature. This is very much coming back to Confucius, of following exemplars for virtue. The other thing we can look at in regard to being ethical is our conduct. Now, this is actually deliberately in white colour because I'm trying to relate the green, purple and orange things to the previous slide conceptually. Conduct relates to all things here because virtue is demonstrated in conduct and following rules is demonstrated in conduct and considering consequences is demonstrated in conduct. Without conduct, nothing actually happens. Conduct is just what we do. Okay, but with a focus on what we do, you could look at what is virtuous, or you could look at what the rules say. Alternatively, you could look at consequences. Consequences are the results of our actions. What we might call, considering this, is what we might call consequentialism. Now, within that, you have two quite opposite ways of considering what is the right thing to do, and they are ethical egoism and utilitarianism. Utilitarianism has a rather awkward name that doesn't tell us very much. Basically, utility is the idea of benefit for people, and utilitarianism is seen as the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. As Bentham put it, the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, this is just silly theory, but wait a second. Without utilitarianism, we would not have democracy, we would not have a social welfare system, we wouldn't have, for example, a legal system under which we're all equal under the law, we wouldn't have universal education, we wouldn't have egalitarianism. So you and I probably would not be here. It would be might is right and the strongest can do what they wish, whereas the weakest will have to suffer. So utilitarianism has created a modern society which allows us to all fulfill some kind of meaningful life that is not miserable. It's very much part of how we live, and it doesn't matter what country you're from. These days, most of us are strongly influenced by utilitarianism. One of the strongest aspects you see in modern society is the equal positions of men and women, which is now seen as an absolute, uncompromisable requirement. And anyone who speaks otherwise would be shouted down. And the same would happen in regards to race. And this is what we have, the egalitarianism, the idea that everyone is equal and should have an equal opportunity, is so important for many of our modern societies. And it all comes back to this way of thinking. And it wasn't developed strictly by Bentham. Bentham articulated it very well, and it developed back from ancient Greek times. Ethical egoism is basically looking after your own needs. Yang Zhu, Chinese philosopher from 440 BC, said something along the lines of, each for himself. Now, many people argued against him. However, he was very influential at that time. Epicurus, in Greek philosophical tradition, posed the idea that our natural needs are good. We should not see them as bad. If we want to eat something, we should not feel guilty about that. If we want to enjoy our lives, we should not feel guilty about that. Perhaps this could be called hedonism. Keep in mind, though, that Epicurus said that we should all moderate our desires in order to be happy. Because in the end, you're trying to be happy for yourself. And drinking 3 bottles of wine is not going to make you happy. Getting all the money in the world is not going to make you happy because other people will be miserable. So it is focused on the self, but it doesn't mean it's a free-for-all that you should make others suffer for yourself. So we shouldn't mistake these philosophers for having that argument. They're saying, fulfill your needs. You can moderate your needs, but fulfill them. There's nothing wrong with that. In recent times, greed is good, and the modern neo-capitalist idea has gone a much more extreme direction than either of these philosophers ever have. The idea is that I look after myself, and that drives the economy, and therefore the money will trickle down to others. And people say this knowing full well that the trickle down of money to other people doesn't really happen. So extreme ethical egoism does exist in this century, and it flourished at the end of the 20th century and is flourishing now. Let's just talk about rules-based ethics for a moment and deontology. If we follow rules without considering virtue or consequences, that could be a rather extreme way of doing things. So as it is, we generally consider rules and virtue and consequences in most of our actions. To illustrate, if I just followed the rules in life, people around me would suffer. It would happen all the time. An extreme example would be if I were a person in charge of a school gate and I was ordered to close the gate exactly at 8 a.m. every day, which I did without fail. And one morning, a young student, just a child, was late. I closed the gate anyway, and the results could be terrible. In that case, if I follow only rules, and I see just following rules as being virtuous, well, I haven't considered the consequences of the rules. As a result, my ethics are a little out of balance with what society expects. They expect me not to close the gate on a person and kill them, causing them suffering and suffering for everyone around them. So you can't just follow rules, you can't just consider consequences, and you can't just consider virtue. With deontology, Immanuel Kant tried to fit all of these concepts together and stated that in order to do something, you need to have a categorical imperative. So you need to have virtue in mind and a reason for doing it. And you need to act on the basis of principle without just seeing consequences as the thing you're trying to get. At this point, it becomes a little bit philosophical, because if you don't get the consequences but you were virtuous, well, what about the poor people who suffered the consequences? So it's a bit of a grey area as to what is correct. So deontology doesn't really tell you what to do in a situation, but it tells you that you can't just accidentally come up with some good consequences and say, what a good boy am I, or a good girl am I. If you hadn't really thought about it, you weren't following rules, you weren't considering what was right or wrong. So to explore what our ethics are, what we need is a dilemma or a problem. A dilemma is a Greek philosophical tool that is basically a question with no answer that you will be satisfied with. You are damned if you do and damned if you don't. However, it's very useful in getting to what is important to you, your ethics. A classical dilemma, this one was originally created by Philip of Foot, and you can have a look at the actual dilemma in detail on the Wikipedia link down the bottom right. The train dilemma involves a speeding train or trolley heading towards a group of people, 5 people, and they will definitely perish. There's no escape for them, and the train can't be stopped. You're a bystander, and there's a rail switch there. You have the opportunity to switch the rail and save their lives. However, in order to do that, you will send the train down a dead-end line, which is a good thing, where one person is and cannot escape, so they will surely die. Do you move the switch to save 5 people and let one die, or do you not move the switch? Now, I don't expect there to be just one answer in your mind. I want you to think about this really hard. Okay, think about this, and then let's have a look at the next slide to see what different types of decisions might reflect about your ethical influences. So let's discuss some possible answers you might have to this problem and what they might mean. Now, only you know what is influencing your decision. So these are just proposals of what these various positions might mean in terms of ethics. So let's have a look at the first one. If you even thought, should I move that lever or not? Okay, so if it was a question for you that you needed to consider, you're thinking about consequences. So consequentialism is a strong influence, which is very common for many people. If you chose to save the 5 people and let one die, and it was a clear decision for you, that would be utilitarianism. That would be one of your main influences. It's terrible that one must die, but by saving 5 lives, maybe society will be bettered and there will be less suffering. Yeah. So the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. Similarly, if you were considering, for example, whether the individual was pregnant or not, or whether one of the 5 was pregnant, or whether they were criminals, etc., etc., you're still thinking about the greatest good for the most people, if in that decision. Then that would be utilitarianism. Okay, so let's have a look at the third one. Some people would choose not to switch the tracks, and they might do it because, well, that's illegal. I'm not going to do that, that's illegal. There could be 2 motivators here. One could be virtue-based and influenced by rules. It is not virtuous to do something illegal. Breaking the law is bad, and that would make me a bad person, and I don't want to be a bad person. So that's virtue-based. Ethical egoism could also drive that decision. Oh, if I broke that law, it could come back on me and I could be punished for doing this. Another reason you could be avoiding breaking the law is that you might think about the consequences of breaking that law. If I start breaking the law here, then I'm being a vigilante, deciding who must live and die, and that gives license to other people to do that. It sets a precedent. Other people are watching. You know, I'm setting up a precedent of making life and death decisions for other people. And so there'd also be a consequentialist possibility. You might choose, as in number 4, not to be involved because it's not the right way to live. It would put blood on your hands. You're not considering so much the law, you're considering more just that's not something that I should do. So this is purely virtue ethics. And the last one, you might choose not to be involved, to not touch the lever, because of a rule in your mind, such as thou shalt not kill, a human shouldn't play God, or I'm not the correct person to decide this, I'm not qualified. So this would be rule-based ethics, either from the 10 Commandments or somewhere else, or in fact just the rule book, if you like. The linesman should be making that decision. At this point, you might be starting to notice that your ethics are rather complicated, and it's the same for most people. So let's explore a little bit further before we go on. Imagine the one person on the track is someone you care about, a family member or a friend. So if you chose to save the 5 people and sacrifice that person, that would make you pretty genuinely a utilitarian. That would mean that you see the good of many above your own needs and the needs of your friend. That would be a very hard decision for many people. Alternatively, you could really be so hesitant that you could not make a decision between the death of 5 people and the death of a loved one or a friend. This would mean that, yes, you have genuine utilitarianism in your ethical makeup, but like any human, or any living thing, you have ethical egoism, which means that you need to deal with your own needs. Yeah, you can't ignore the fact that letting your friend die will haunt you forever. And moreover, that person you love, you just don't want them to die. A third possibility is that you clearly choose to save your loved one and unfortunately let the others die. This would be ethical egoism. Now, we can't condemn this, it is an ethical choice, but just be aware that that ethical egoism isn't always in harmony with rules-based ethics and virtue-based ethics, which drives a lot of the ethical codes of conduct and laws in our society. Okay, let's change the problem again, or the dilemma again, as we often do in order to look at different philosophical angles. Imagine the 5 people were actually hardened, violent criminals who've had many chances to reform but haven't. And the other person, that one on the line, is an innocent, someone who's never done anything wrong, someone who, a person who's doing their best for society. And you know that because you know these people, for example. So if you decide that the innocent should not die in order to save criminals, and so you let the criminals die, that would mean, yes, you're a consequentialist, you're possibly utilitarian because you see the benefit to society of keeping the innocent person and the loss to society of keeping the criminals. You're possibly rule-based in that society would sanction what you're doing, protect the innocent over the guilty. People wouldn't say, oh, you let 6 or 5 people die, what a terrible person you are. Society would probably say, you saved the innocent. So you don't have to live in fear of being condemned. So consequentialism, utilitarianism, and rules would possibly affect your behaviour there. These are just 2 alterations we could make to the dilemma in order to explore ethics, and I've only put a couple of possible answers, in fact the second one just one answer, which may not be your answer. You, I think, now know, if you have a different answer to one of these, you now know how to go back to the slides above and think about what is driving your ethics in that decision, whether it's virtue, following rules, consequences, ethical egoism, or utilitarianism. And it's probably a mixture of a number of those. But don't just give up and go, it's a mixture of a number of them, I walk away, because you really need to understand what is driving your decision making for the next step, because we have to figure out whether your ethical makeup matches that of your organisation, and there might be one little area where it does not, so you'll need to keep an eye out for that. So now we've thought a little bit about what kind of ethical motivations drive your decision making. It's time to look at how that works or will work with the code of conduct for your professional organisation. So go back up to the links in the previous slides and look for one for your potential future career. Look through that code of ethics or code of conduct, and as you read through, ask yourself, in order to work in my profession, what kind of ethics do I need to apply? Am I acting out of virtue or rules, or considering consequences? Am I considering utilitarianism or ethical egoism? Which ones am I most likely to be applying here? And where there are rules, do the rules fit my personal ethics? Should I make decisions relating to my work based on the code of ethics and code of conduct, or based on my personal ethics? This is very important. Consider that one. And finally, if your ethics do not match the ethics or the ethical code of conduct of your organisation or professional association, are you in the right profession? And what should you do? Let's just check how our ethics work again with an example. Imagine you're a pharmacist in a country where medical marijuana is not yet available or legal. Your child has epilepsy that is not responding to standard treatments, and each seizure causes incremental permanent brain injury. You know how to illegally obtain safe medical grade cannabis oil. You can get a regular, safe supply of cannabis oil that will definitely, as demonstrated by research, prevent the seizures. So, all other things aside, this is what we have to do for such a question. Would you access that cannabis oil and treat your child? The result would be that the child could go on to have a completely happy life with minimal brain damage. And they're growing very quickly, so they could probably overcome any damage they've already sustained. And what things might affect your decision? So, for example, there's 0 chance of being caught, or there's 20% chance of being caught. Would that affect your decision to do this or not? Society's acceptance of your actions. So, if you're in a society which accepts marijuana use, such as Australia, then you know that you wouldn't be condemned for doing it. What if you're in a country where marijuana was seen like a very hard drug, and it is in some countries? Would you still do it? And, of course, thinking about others. What if the supplier had a chance of being caught? If you thought the supplier was 0% likely of getting caught, and they were very professional in what they did, and for some reason you knew they weren't going to get caught, versus there's a 20% chance they might get caught. How does your action affect them? Do you have a responsibility to them? Okay, so that's something you might consider and discuss in the tutorial. So now we've thought a little bit about what kind of ethical motivations drive your decision making. It's time to look at how that works or will work with the code of conduct for your professional organisation. So go back up to the links in the previous slides and look for one for your potential future career. Look through that code of ethics or code of conduct, and as you read through, ask yourself, in order to work in my profession, what kind of ethics do I need to apply? Am I acting out of virtue or rules, or considering consequences? Am I considering utilitarianism or ethical egoism? Which ones am I most likely to be applying here? And where there are rules, do the rules fit my personal ethics? Should I make decisions relating to my work based on the code of ethics and code of conduct, or based on my personal ethics? This is very important. Consider that one. And finally, if your ethics do not match the ethics or the ethical code of conduct of your organisation or professional association, are you in the right profession? And what should you do? So let's look at some of the reasons why people might not behave in line with their professional ethical code. It happens often. Why do people do things that they shouldn't do at work? What factors are there? Let's call them hazards. The first type would be internal, individual factors. The first would be their knowledge or lack of knowledge of the relevant code of ethics and conduct, which is why I'm advising you to go and check out the codes of conduct. If you don't know what you shouldn't be doing, you could accidentally do the wrong thing. Not just that, but by not going and finding out when it was readily available, haven't you deliberately given yourself an excuse to do the wrong thing? So choosing not to know is also part of the ethical process. The second thing is impairment. Now, impairment here is in a much broader term. We could be impaired by an emotional state, by stress. Job insecurity can cause that stress. Our finances can cause that. They can cause us to make practical and sometimes irrational decisions which are against our ethical codes. This happens all the time. Often at work, in some situations anyway, someone will be asked to do something which they know isn't really 100% ethical, but there's no one to see and there's no direct victim and there's unlikely to be any kind of negative tangible consequence in the short term. They're under a lot of pressure from their employer, so they just cut that corner and do that thing they're told to do, actually opening themselves up very much to problems later on. I mean, that goes on your record somehow, if it ever gets found out. And once you go up from being, say, a kitchen hand or an apprentice to a higher position, these kind of decisions that you've made can come back on you. And in particular, when you're in those slightly higher positions as a professional, once you've basically got your diploma or you've got your bachelor degree, you're expected to uphold a much higher ethical standard. There's no excuses then. Okay, so impairment are the things in our lives or in our work situations which make us feel forced to do an unethical thing. Another thing that can lead to an unethical action is a sense of entitlement. So if I'm a politician and I've been serving in federal parliament for 20 years and I have a function to go to, and instead of taking my car, I take a helicopter, which costs the people of Australia $20,000. And it's all very glamorous and interesting. If I don't see there being a problem there, that kind of makes me entitled in my attitude. I believe that I'm entitled to that. And so this sense of entitlement drives me to do something which is against the ethical codes, the standards that Australian people expect of politicians, which are actually in the ethical codes provided to members of parliament. Okay, so a sense of entitlement, or I deserve this. Sometimes you'll be working with someone and they feel they don't get paid enough, and then they pocket something out of the stock room, out of the storeroom, and they look at you and they go, "What?" You say, "What are you doing?" You say, "Look, they hardly pay me. I deserve this. I'm just getting the bit that they don't pay me." That's a sense of entitlement. Even if you are unhappy with your pay, a sense of entitlement is what's driving that behaviour. Okay, so the fourth one would be high or low self-efficacy in various aspects of work, but in particular in their position as a worker. So if you feel confident as a professional and confident socially in order to negotiate and argue your position, if you're under pressure to make an unethical decision, you can stand up for yourself, and even if they fire you, you don't care, because as a confident professional, you get work somewhere else. If you're not confident as a professional, you might be scared of losing your job because you don't feel confident about getting another one, for example. Or if you lack social confidence, you might lack that ability to resist peer pressure or to resist pressure from someone in a position of authority. So these are things within the individual that can strongly affect, be hazards in decisions we make as professionals, and can lead us to do things which are actually unethical when it comes to our professional code. It is much more common than you think, and so what we're talking about in ethics today is basically equipping you so that you don't fall for any of these pitfalls. Then there are the external factors that can lead an individual to making a decision that breaks the ethical professional code. So there could be a strong workplace culture that does not adhere to the ethical codes. Everyone's doing it. You're expected to do it too. But that thing is not in line with what the ethical guidelines of your profession say. There can be institutional structures that are highly authoritative, that do not listen to lower end staff, for example, or they are weak and they lack leadership. The structures of an institution and how it is managed can lead to unethical decision making at all levels, from executive down to the bottom level. So competent management of an organisation with a clear adherence and understanding of ethical requirements is essential to the organisation allowing individuals to make decisions in line with their ethical codes of conduct, or codes of ethics or codes of conduct. The third external factor is deferring to authority, where authority is so strong that we have no choice but to defer to their word on pain of punishment or whatever. That also can be seen as an individual trait, the tendency to defer to authority. And the last of these is peer pressure. So the workplace and the institution might be doing the right things, but just the staff members around you are pressuring you in various ways to do the wrong thing. This, again, could come down to the management of the organisation, because they've employed those staff and they should be overseeing them and maintaining ethical standards in the organisation. Nonetheless, for a member of staff, or any professional as a member of staff, you'll experience that as peer pressure, and you'll need to learn how to deal with it as peer pressure. It'll take a long time before the institution can wipe that peer pressure out. Okay, so let's have a look at what you can do to mitigate some of these issues, these factors or hazards, if you like, in the next slide. You manage your ethical decision making in your profession and in your study when you're under pressure or when you encounter various hazards, whether they're within yourself or whether they're external. Well, you need to mitigate these by identifying them first and then dealing with them. If we look at individual internal hazards, you need to know the code of ethics and the code of conduct for your organisation or the organisations. You go and find them, read through them, understand how your ethics intersect with those, and make sure that they correlate, or that you can at least compromise to adhere to those rules. The next thing is identify and isolate any impairments in your life and keep an eye on them so that they don't interfere with your decision making. So whether that's your emotional state, job insecurity, your finances, medical situation, you've got to make sure that even though you might have some difficulties, they don't affect your decision making. Because if you do let them affect your decision making, while anyone could sympathise, you're a professional and you shouldn't let them interfere with your decision making. The third thing is identify and eliminate any sense of entitlement within yourself. If you find yourself saying, I'm breaking a rule, but I deserve this, well, there you go. That's what you should not be doing. So what might be happening here is if you have accepted work conditions which are not satisfactory to you, and then you have a sense of entitlement as a result, rather than doing the wrong thing as a result, for example, doing a sloppy job because even though you're ethically bound to do a good job at something, doing a sloppy job because they don't pay you very well, that's not how you should be approaching it. You should be thinking, I'll do a very good job and they will pay me, and if they won't pay me, I'll quit. And you think, Richard, seriously? I think, well, Australia has, a safety net for people when they move positions between jobs, and in the end, it's better to work while maintaining ethical integrity than to slowly become less and less ethical through your career. As Socrates pointed out, and Aristotle pointed out, doing good things is what leads you to being happy. All right, let's look at some of the external ethical hazards and how you can mitigate them. Identify, firstly, ethical hazards in your workplace. They could be in the workplace culture, they could be in institutional structures, they could be in deference to authority within you and your peers, and any peer pressure. So what you need to do after that is to raise issues and to find support in like-minded colleagues. Now you can raise the issues with the union or with higher ranking staff or your professional association or at any branch of HR, which is about the welfare of workers or so forth. If you find hostility, then do you really want to keep working there? At which point you might say, do I have a choice? And I would say, well, yes, you do. In the end, you do have a choice. You might have to take lower pay somewhere else and have fewer work opportunities in terms of professional development. in order to stick with your ethics. That's your choice, but I would say if you compromise your ethics just to get more professional opportunities, position, and pay, in the end, will you really be happy with that? Some of you might think, I've got the money, I'll be happy. Well, really think about that. Maybe go back to the slides about some of the philosophers there and think about life and money and what it really means, for example. Okay, now leaving the organisation and whistleblowing might cause you temporary pain, but in the end, you've got that as your legacy. You did the right thing, and you can be content about that. It might not always be easy, but it's better to do that. The other way of doing it is to leave the organisation, all smiles, thank yous and handshakes, and work somewhere else. You don't have to necessarily be a whistleblower, and no one needs to get hurt. Some might say it's cowardly, but if the organisation is much stronger than you are, that's a perfectly common answer. But whatever you do, don't stay in an organisation which will not address these hazards that it might have that is affecting ethical decision making. If in your organisation many people are being forced or feel obliged to act against a professional code, there's a major problem, and you really don't want to stay in that organisation. In short, to manage your ethical decision making in your profession and in your study, make sure you know the code of ethics, explore the complexities of your own personal ethics and reconcile them with the code of ethics you must follow, and then, when in the professional situation or study situation, identify the internal and external hazards that you face and mitigate against those hazards. Yeah. Don't be complacent there. It's important to identify where the problems are, the ethical hazards, and to deal with them. If you have a friend who often asks you to help them with their assignment in an appropriate way, you've got to recognize that as a risk to yourself and to them and to the people around you, and you've got to deal with it. You've got to be brave and say to them, no, sorry, it will not help you in the long term. And they say, come on, oh please. And you go, no, I'm not doing that, and I don't think anyone else should. There it is. You know, have principles and stand by them. You might think it's harder than it looks, but once you start doing it, it becomes a habit. Many of you are doing it already, of course. What I'd like you to do at the end of this lecture is find your professional organisation, the links above, for example, download the code of ethics or code of conduct, read through it and make sure you understand it and can abide by it. Bring your ideas about this lecture and particularly about what you've read in your professional organisation's code and to the learning experience classes for week 4. Complete the learning tasks after you finish your learning experience and while considering the ideas we've learned about ethics. And consider how the ideas in this PowerPoint, this lecture, relate to your course assessment and also how they will relate to your academic and professional skills development in the long term. Okay, thank you. That concludes this lecture on ethics and your professional and academic career, and I hope it's been informative.